have two things I need from you.
Okay.
Thing one, we need to pick a title. So let me go through some of the things that you said that would make a good title, and you just tell me your favorite, all right?
Okay.
A series of interviews, a stray gay boy, they didn't deserve to be in jail, clubs, customs, and code words, an area called Queen's Row, he'd blow kisses, I have a story to tell, or get involved.
How about they didn't belong in jail, witness from the persecution?
Got it. All right, I will get that recorded for our
Or
title.
they didn't belong in prison, or, one of those. I'll leave it up to you guys. I'm not, those are my 2 cents that I can add, but I think I'd like to leave it up to you guys to pick the title.
Welcome to Season 6, Episode 50. They didn't deserve to be in jail.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. I'm Baz Collins here with my co-host,
Vance Bastian.
And today we have Robert C. Steele in the hot seat. Robert served as a reporter and producer at various radio and television stations in Colorado and Arizona. He was a broadcaster at the Italian National Broadcasting Company, RAI Radiotelevisione Italiana, in Naples, Italy. Was a reporter for Armed Forces Radio and Television along the coast of Vietnam, the Asian Western Pacific, and Vicenza, Italy. And as a volunteer activist in the early gay liberation movement with 2 weekly gay radio shows in Colorado. Later, as a federal government public affairs officer, he served as a government spokesperson and managed media relations with reporters who worked for media outlets from across the USA and around the world. Robert, welcome to the show.
Hi, Vance and Baz. It's a real pleasure to join you and your audience today.
We're pretty glad you made it, especially considering the holiday season and the last minute notice.
Oh, that's okay. I'm enjoying the holiday season.
There you go.
So where did the fire come to write this book? What was the spark?
Well, Jim lived a very different life than what I lived. And Jim and I met as activists in the early 1970s gay liberation movement. And at that time, we all thought that we were on the threshold of very positive expectations. And we were making exciting strides in this gay civil rights movement that we were all embarking on. And it was a new time of gay militancy, and homosexuality was being discussed more openly for the very first time by society and the media. So a couple of decades later, in the 1990s, I did a series of interviews of Jim for this book, Banned from California. And at that time, I was working full time, and I simply did not want to work my life away on the book in my evenings and on my weekends. So then it was about 20 years later, after I retired, that I earnestly began writing this book. And about 6 or 7 years ago, I realized that I had to start getting Banned from California written and published. I absolutely could not let this story be lost to history, because it was an important story that absolutely had to be told and offered to people. And I would just say that even though Banned from California is a biography about Jim Foshee's life, it's really a lot more than that. It's a look at a certain time in LGBT history and the culture and history of the gay civil rights movement in the USA. Serves as a backdrop for Jim's life and all of his many travels. And we see 70 years of American culture through the eyes of this gay American.
So let's dive into...
And where in California did it actually, when you met him and you say you were part of the liberation movement, where in California did this take place?
Actually, we met in Denver, Colorado. He had moved to Denver, Colorado in 1969. And after I got out of the military, I moved to Denver in 1972. And we both met in 1973, working in the gay liberation movement in Denver.
Oh, okay. Gotcha. Okay. So why the title of Banned in California, if you want to explain it to our viewers?
Well, let me start here.
Okay.
Banned from California is a biography. And in 1954, Jim hitchhiked 800 miles from his abusive family in Idaho to the land that church members called a place populated by queers and fruits. And so he sets out on this adventure that redefines his life and puts him in the midst of the civil rights struggle of gay people across the USA, spanning a half century. So when he gets in LA, he meets a drag queen there, and she realizes that he's a runaway. So she gives him refuge in her house, in her home, and he feels safe because he's got his own bedroom, and Bunny is in the next room, in her bedroom, with an eye looking over him and making sure that he's safe. Well, a couple weeks later, Bunny's lover, partner, returns from Montana, where he was visiting relatives, and he's scandalized to see a stray gay boy, teenager, in his home with Bunny, and he tells Bunny that this teenager has got to go. He cannot stay there. So Jim was kicked out, and he goes to a nearby park, and he realizes that he needs to hightail it back to Idaho. And he sees a policeman there, and he remembers what his mother said, is that a policeman is always your best friend. If you ever get in trouble, you go to a policeman and you ask him to help you. And so Jim went up and he asked him if he could get a ride out of town. And the cop looks at him and, and he says, yeah, I want to go back home to Idaho. And so the cop says, well, we might be able to give you a ride. Come with me. And the cop was nice enough to escort Jim to the police station. And so Jim gets to the police station and he sits on the bench smiling that his luck has turned and that he gave quite a good performance. And so these two juvenile detectives come down and they start interrogating Jim, and they find out all about him. Where have you been? What have you been doing here in LA? And they get out of him that he's been given refuge with Bunny, the drag queen, and her lover. And so they tell him, okay. They have him sign some papers, a lot of mumbo jumbo language that young Jim did not understand. And so he smiles and figures they're going to take him to the train station. They promised that he'd go home in his own train bunk, in his own room there. But instead they take him to the juvenile facility, a jail for juvenile delinquents. And he stayed there for a few weeks. And finally, one day, a social worker comes in and tells him that he's going to court the next day. And Jim was scared, thinking, oh, here we go. They're going to prosecute me for my crimes. And the next day, they took him to the big courthouse. And he enters this big courtroom. And they immediately put him on the stand. And he looks out in the audience and he's embarrassed. But there's Bunny and her boyfriend. And Jim thinks, oh, they're here too. And the prosecutor starts interrogating Jim. Now, you're a good, truthful boy. you know the difference between telling the truth and not? And Jim says yes. And he asked Jim to tell the court what he'd been doing in Los Angeles. And so Jim started telling, and the prosecutor starts laying out what he wants the judge to hear, and he uses terms like oral sodomy and anal sodomy, and he did not use terms that Jim would understand, like queer and pervert. But then he spells it out, and the audience is scandalized, and Jim realizes what the court is up to. And he thinks, I can't let them do this to Bunny and her boyfriend. They don't deserve to be in jail. So Jim yells out, no, they didn't do it. The police made me say it. And the courtroom erupts, and the prosecutor tells the judge, I don't understand this. We have a signed statement from this witness. And the judge, he declares a pause to the hearing, and he tells the social worker that he wants to see Jim in his office. And so Jim and the social worker goes to the judge's quarters, and they start talking, and the judge says, for the life of me, I can't understand why you're protecting these perverts. We could have sent them up for years. And the judge says, now look, we can just go back into the courtroom and we can ignore your previous testimony and we can start over. And Jim says, no, I won't do it. And the judge blows his top and he says, you go back home to your parents in Idaho and you stay there. You can never come back here. I ban you from the state of California. And Jim was so young, a teenager, he didn't know whether the judge actually could ban him from a state or not. But even though he was banned, he returned to California over and over.
Wow.
That is an amazing story. I mean, it's so exemplary of how queer people were maligned, thinking that, because they would, as you say, they would use terms that typically we did not use within the context of our burgeoning society at that point, and then within the queer community. And, it's tantamount to entrapment. That's what it is.
Yeah. Yeah, he would run away from his abusive home in Idaho, and he'd land over and over in 1950s Los Angeles's underground world of homosexuals and early queer culture. And he unwittingly ended up eyewitness to the beginnings of the LGBTQ civil rights movement. And in this book, Banned from California, readers experience Jim's adventures and misadventures, and they live history as seen through the eyes of this gay American. Because Banned from California tells an entertaining true story. It's a historical coming-of-age story and a lifelong biography. And it portrays a lot about our history and about the oppression in the 1950s and beyond that Jim Foshee and other homosexuals endured as the movement for gay civil rights and equal rights began. And readers see the price that people paid for breaking society's rules and norms and laws back in those days.
What did the gay rights movement look like before Stonewall?
Well, life was tough for homosexuals. In the 1950s, homosexual acts were illegal in all of the states across the country. And even the Civil Liberties Union asserted that civil rights did not pertain to homosexuals. And the Vice Squad was always on the lookout for homosexuals. And if you were convicted of sodomy, you could spend years in prison. In the early 1950s, during the McCarthy era, that a lot of people have heard of, you had U.S. Senator Joseph McCarthy
From
embarking.
Wisconsin.
Yes, you're right, Wisconsin. And
I'm very familiar with this history.
oh yeah, he embarked on a highly publicized quest to rid the government of communists and homosexuals. And in the U.S. House of Representatives, the House Un-American Activities Committee also investigated communists and homosexuals, and also President Dwight Eisenhower issued an executive order declaring that sexual perversion was grounds for homosexuals to be fired from their jobs. But nonetheless, Jim lived an openly gay teenage life in the 1950s. And doing that at that time was seen as criminal behavior. So Banned from California places Jim's story within the context of the gay civil rights movement during the Cold War and McCarthyism. Gay America was in the shadows, and it was a secret subculture with its own clubs and customs and code words. In fact, Jim dated older men. He told me that he thought the word gay was cool to use, but that put off some older guys he dated because they thought that Jim and other younger guys were ruining a good code word by popularly using gay, and that before long, guys would be afraid to ask anybody if they were gay because everybody else would have learned what gay meant. And whenever he left a bar with a guy, they'd end up walking 2 or 3 blocks to the guy's older car because they never parked next to a gay bar. These men usually had good jobs, and they didn't want their livelihoods threatened by an arrest.
I know you said he was taken to a juvenile detention center. Did he ever get taken to any other like mental hospitals or anything like that?
Yes, absolutely. In Banned from California, I detailed Jim's young life being essentially institutionalized. First, he was institutionalized when his mother placed him and his older sister in an orphanage when he was just 3 years old. Jim's older sister, Ruthie, was 8 at the time, and they'd already experienced the loss of their daddy, who had died the year before. And then in the orphanage, she had to deal with the emotional trauma of being left alone in a strange place without either parent. But Jim was so young, at 3 years old, that he told me that he really did not remember anything about entering the orphanage. So he didn't remember how he initially dealt with it. But anyway, after 3 years that the kids spent in the orphanage, Jim's mother brought the kids back home to live with her, and they settled in together. But Jim couldn't remember anything about his mother before living in the orphanage. He said that she seemed like a nice lady, but he couldn't remember anything about her. He told me that he didn't think he was really capable of bonding with her because he had already lived half of his young life at the orphanage without his mother. So she married Jim's first stepfather, and his discipline that he metered out to the 2 kids amounted to beating Jim and his sister whenever he thought that the 2 children came under the influence of the devil. And this apparently happened so often that Jim, during one particular period, ran away from home every day. So then at about age 13, Jim was placed in a reform school to correct his runaway tendencies and other incorrigible behavior. The older juvenile delinquents took sexual advantage of Jim. He was young and very effeminate, and Jim couldn't really tell these other guys no They just took what they wanted from Jim. And then the reform school staff found out that a lot of the older teenagers were having sex encounters with Jim. And the house fathers thought that Jim was at fault and told him that he was a bad influence on the older juvenile delinquents. So the training school's medical staff determined that Jim was mentally ill with severe social maladjustment problems, and they transferred the 14-year-old out of the reform school and into Idaho's state mental hospital. And from then through the rest of his teenage years, Jim lived mainly at that mental institution. But the Idaho Mental Hospital was a fairly progressive medical institution by the 1960s, and they eventually concluded that Jim was not mentally ill. But their main concern about Jim was that they were afraid he was becoming institutionalized again, this time at the mental hospital, and they tried various techniques to reintegrate him back into society. However, Jim was a lot more comfortable away from home and away from society, and he couldn't wait to get back to the mental hospital where his real friends lived and where all the people who truly cared for him were at. Jim realized deep down that he was alienated from all other kids and from all the people he knew in Idaho, and he couldn't be truthful and tell people who he really was, because after all, not only was he gay and running off to California, but he was living most of his teenage life in a mental institution.
Right. Now, in the notes, I also saw that he worked on a chain gang.
That's right.
How did he get to that?
Well, in the book Banned from California, Texas comes into direct focus. In 1962, Jim Foshee visited Dallas. He always stayed far away from his dysfunctional family and far away from his abusive home. But by that time, money had become a problem, and he'd been registered at the Dallas YMCA for about a week or 10 days, and he'd spent all of his money and owed one more day's rent, and he didn't know how he was going to pay, so he ended up stealing a billfold with $100 in it, and he paid the YMCA, and then he took a taxi cab to a nearby hotel, but the police tracked down the taxi cab's route, and they busted Jim in his hotel room, and they discovered the stolen billfold and the money in his suitcase. Obviously, Jim's life had degenerated into stealing money to get by. So Jim was a young 23-year-old guy, and this was probably the biggest mistake of Jim's life. So anyway, the Dallas County Criminal District Court, Jim pleaded guilty there, and the judge handed him a 5-year prison sentence in the Texas penitentiaries system, the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. And a few chapters in Banned from California covers the time that Jim spent in prison. And in the book, we learn a lot about Jim's upbringing as a chronic runaway from his dysfunctional family. And the book details his repeated placements in institutions. And so it really was almost a foregone conclusion that he'd eventually end up in prison.
Did he turn his life around?
Oh yeah, as when he left prison, he had promised himself he would never go back, and he cut all of his ties from prison. He knew a lot of the prisoners there. There were a lot of hardened prisoners and a lot of dangers in the prison. He served on a prison farm where he toiled on a chain gang, and summertime life was miserable. Jim and the other chain gang prisoners were forced to endure back-breaking work, and the prisoners sweated under the hot, blazing sun, working the ground, digging trenches, building irrigation structures and harvesting crops. And the work itself was physical abuse. They constantly worked and could not stop. But Jim was the closest thing to a lady out there on the chain gang that anybody had ever seen there before. So for the uniformed field boss called Boss, he and Jim, it became a regular routine. Boss would sit on his horse, bored out of his mind, and he'd call Jim forward and he would gripe about Jim's work methods. Keep your hoe near the ground when you hoe, and don't bend your legs when you scrape the irrigation ditch, and keep your feet apart when you shovel, and on and on. But Boss concluded pretty quickly that he was not going to be successful into making Jim into a masculine laborer. So Jim was forced to endure the chain gang in the prison farm. And then after the chain gang, Jim eventually was transferred to the main prison where he was segregated with other queer prisoners in an area called Queen's Row. And he was confined there inside a solitary jail cell all by himself. And the queens there were kept separated from the straight prisoners, but that only ended up depriving the bulls of effeminate queens for passionate sex. So they terrorized young masculine straight guys who they coerced to get sex, because getting to know Jim was extremely difficult for most guys in prison because the guards maintained a very close watch over him. He might not have been the only queen to be in prison, but at that time, he was the youngest and the prettiest. So whenever guards escorted Jim throughout the prison to appointments, he'd flirt around and he'd blow kisses to the other convicts to make them feel good. And in turn, they'd wink at Jim and make wolf whistles to him. And so Jim acquired a lot of boyfriends throughout the prison who communicated with him through love notes. And these love letters were secretly passed back and forth by runners who swept and mopped the tiers and delivered food trays. And these runners, who were prisoners, also wheeled carts to various prisoners. And these carts contained commissary like soap and towels and cigarettes and newspapers and stuff. And so Jim's so-called boyfriends would send him not only love letters, but they sent him commissary gifts that Jim thought he needed so he could better endure prison life.
Well, that's one way to work the system.
Right?
He did.
You do what you gotta do, girl.
That's right. He used his wits, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But
and I think that really highlights the resiliency of early queer life. I mean, when you think about, as you explained, all of the legal ramifications just existing as a queer person, and yet we somehow managed, and we somehow still found a way to find each other for support, and the chosen family, the family you gather around yourself through association, through friendships, through love relationships, and so forth. And I think that's one of the strongest parts about, and even it mirrors what happened with the queers in Berlin of 1939 and World War II. They had a burgeoning open community. Even straight people visited those gay clubs and stuff, which is why you have the movie like Cabaret. But, you have all of that. And yet, within a matter of weeks, it all came crashing down and suddenly they were in concentration camps. But there's a resilience within the community that somehow we still manage to get through. Not all of us make it, but it is something that, if there is a gay power that, like all the straight conservatives say we have, that's our power. Our power is to survive. And it's something that the queer community does know how to do.
Oh, yes. You know, Jim told me that almost every gay person he had ever known has suffered to some extent at at the hands of their heterosexual parents. And
Hmm.
his childhood and teen years clearly qualified him as an abused child at the hands of his fundamentally religious mother and his sadistic first stepfather.
Hmm.
So Jim's move to Denver in 1969 coincided with a new, robust national discourse about homosexuality. The Stonewall uprising occurred right a month after Jim arrived in Denver, and the counterculture movement was growing, and gay civil rights groups were organizing across the country. So Jim decided to get involved, and he found a cause worth living for.
Hmm.
Jim was no longer at the mercy of the persecution around him. And after all of that, plus being incarcerated in the Texas prison system and forced to work on that chain gang, Jim decided to turn his life around. And he found a purpose in life, becoming an architect and a foot soldier in the gay liberation movement. And it was though Jim was made for the movement. He took control of his own life by putting his destiny in his own hands. And that's
Hmm.
what I would suggest to the young people of today. Get involved and you'll feel a lot better about yourself. And it's like you two, you're doing great things with what you're doing with your podcast. And I really look up for you and, um, and I congratulate you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
You
So,
know,
I mean,
they,
part of it is, for us, while we do fictional writers and that kind of thing, it's always a welcome refresh to get queer history coming to the community. As you say, a lot of the young, as Billy Porter says, and I often quote, the children often don't know their history. They don't know, I remember being at the San Francisco Gay Pride, which is one of the largest prides in the country. And I remember there were three gay boys, and we were watching the parade go by, and Nancy Pelosi went by, who's from San Francisco, and these queer boys were trying to figure out who she was. They didn't even know who she was. And I had to explain to them who she was, and that she, at the time, Trump was still in office. But, I explained to them that she's third in line to the presidency, and what an staunch ally she's been for our community, and yada, yada, yada. And you could just see light bulbs going off in their heads like, oh, I had no idea. And it's because in youth, I think a lot of the children nowadays, excuse me, a lot of the children nowadays have a real, I don't want to say sense of entitlement, because I don't think that they've ever understood the hardships our generations went through so they can enjoy what they have. And I think over time it's starting to become more present. And of course, those young kids grow up and they start to experience more of the history of queerness, and I think that, when people like us who do these podcasts, it's because we want to celebrate, we want to remind our younger generations of the before time and how hard it was, and and to stay vigilant, because just because we have it now doesn't mean it's going to be here tomorrow. We have to stay
absolutely.
vigilant,
right.
you know.
Absolutely. To keep from losing equal rights, the young people are going to have to be vigilant and constantly fight for their rights, or
Hmm.
these rights will be taken away. Because you probably know right now, legal briefs are being written by conservative right wing lawyers. And not only are they encouraging that the US Supreme Court, overturn Roe v. Wade, but
Hmm.
they're also writing briefs with the eye of overturning Lawrence v. Texas, which ruled that state laws banning homosexual sodomy are unconstitutional, and writing briefs overturning Obergefell versus Hodges, which granted LGBTQ people the right to same-sex marriage.
Hmm.
So people don't realize, and the young people don't realize that those two current rights and a lot of our equal rights could easily be overturned by this new super conservative Supreme Court.
Along those lines, I was going to ask, what can the young readers today learn from Jim's struggle about standing up for their rights?
Well, I would say that to get involved, make sure that you read and you know what's going on in the country, and most importantly, that you support and vote for the politicians that are and most importantly, that you support and vote for the politicians who are pro-gay and not against us. It's very important to vote, especially for the president, because he is the one who appoints members of the U.S. Supreme Court. And read, make sure that that you keep informed. Especially, you know, we have the gay press, and most queer people can pick up copies of the gay press in various locations, and including gay bars. And the gay press is very important. In fact, the gay press was the true turning point in the rise of the gay civil rights movement. And because back in the 1950s, the gay press was really a radical new type of publication that permeated this fledgling gay civil rights movement. One magazine is something that most people have never heard of, but it first began publishing in 1953, and it was the first enduring gay publication in the USA. And it was about the size of Reader's Digest, but it had fewer pages, only about 2 or 3 dozen pages per issue. But by 1957, about 3,000 monthly copies were printed, and they were sold through subscriptions, and it was also sold on newsstands. And it essentially marked the true beginning of the gay press. And one positioned itself into the forefront, of the emerging queer movement, and it awakened homosexuals nationwide. Most straight people...
You had like the Mattachine Society, the Daughters of Bilitis, you know, you had those publications. And I remember there's a great documentary. I'll find the link for it and I'll put it in the video of this, but there's a great documentary that talks about, I think it's Pride. I think it's the new one that just came out, excuse me, about a year ago. And they cover the rise of those gay presses and how important they were, and also how secretive they had to be in disseminating, because that was also against the law if you sent something like that through the post.
Right? Oh yeah, most straight people were unaware of One magazine, but straight people who did pay attention to it were absolutely scared by the magazine, because now instead of finding a communist under every bed, they were finding a queer there. So I have a story to tell your listeners, and that is
absolutely.
A couple of years after One started publishing, as you say and alluded to, the U.S. Post Office impounded the magazine's October '54 edition, and it called the magazine obscene and filthy, and the Post Office absolutely refused to deliver One through the mail. So One took the Post Office to court in Los Angeles, and they lost because the judge ruled that the magazine was calculated to stimulate the lust of homosexual readers. So One appeared. I
got news for him. We were already lustful. Sorry, I had to go there. You opened the door. I had to walk through.
Well, anyway, One appealed the judge's ruling appealing to the U.S. Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and they lost again because the appeals court ruled that articles in the magazine were nothing more than cheap pornography, morally depraved and debased. So after these two legal setbacks, one staff members were dejected and dispirited, but one's attorney wanted to take their court case to, of all things, the U.S. Supreme Court. One's staff members were pessimistic, but they okayed their attorney's plan of action. Okay, go ahead. And then the Supreme Court handed down its ruling. It did not even hear oral arguments. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled unanimously in one's favor. The High Court reversed the two lower courts' opinions, and the High Court essentially ruled that one magazine's discussions of homosexuality was not obscene, that it was an exercise of free speech, that homosexuals had the same right to freedom of the press as anybody else in the USA. And this was the first legal victory for homosexuals in the U.S. Supreme Court, which at that time was a very liberal court, unlike the super conservative court nowadays. And that important landmark decision back in 1958 made it possible for homosexual publications to exist, which allowed the equal rights for homosexuals movement to develop and advance. And one magazine fought and won that critical, crucial initial battle.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Important. Very important history.
So, Robert, folks can buy this, can buy Banned from California from Amazon and bookstores?
Yes, Amazon, bookstores, Google Books, most anywhere that books are sold. And also they can buy it and check out the book's website, which is bandca.com. And band is spelled BANNED. CA stands for California.com, bandca.com. And it has all sorts of information about the book, and it talks about some of the reviews that the book has been able to garner.
Perfect. Well, folks, we at Written on the Edge are proud to introduce you to new media by queer content creators. If you're enjoying learning about these artists, please like, subscribe so you can get alerts for new episodes. Also, check out our Redbubble store if you want to support us. Put on a t-shirt with a fun drag queen or a classic author with a great quote, and we'll keep
There are new designs up there.
There are new designs coming, and we'll keep ourselves on the air. So if people want to keep up with your work and any future work you're doing along these topics, bandca.com is the best place for them to go?
That's right. That's the website for the book. And, you know, I never really aspired to be a book author. I was a lot more interested in reporting and journalism, but I had this story that absolutely had to be told and shared with people. And it took a lot out of me. And at my age, in the 70s, and my husband's also in his 70s, I really think I'm done writing in my career. I'm truly retired now. So I'm going to sit back and enjoy retirement, except for trying to get this book into the public consciousness so that they can share with it and enjoy and learn from Jim's fantastic story.
Yeah, and it's important to also, you know, as someone who's in retirement, you get to consume other queer media and see what the others are doing, you know, and it all adds to our rich tapestry of the queer community.
Mm-hmm. It's wonderful. And I've listened to some of your podcasts, and I found a book or two from your podcasts that that I ordered.
Good. Thank you for letting us know, because we are doing our best to help all of our queer authors get discovered. So
thank you.
Do you have any final words of wisdom for people?
Oh, for what wisdom I have?
That was a lot like the, what have you, you know?
I would just say you'll feel a a lot better about yourself if instead of facing any possible persecution or backlash, get involved, and you'll have more respect for yourself. And
Perfect.
that's about the only thing I could suggest.
Perfect. All right,
Right,
folks.
and I would add, based upon what you've explained here, I would add that, you know, many people, many queer people think, what have I got to contribute that I could write about? But, you know, your story of Jim is clearly one of those tales that would have been lost to history if you had not put it down. And that people who think, oh, well, who would want to read my story? You would be surprised at how many people might gravitate to a work of your story or a story of someone you know that you're in awe of. You know, I think your tale of writing this book should be an encouragement to other potential authors out there, people who have interesting stories, interesting queer stories to add to our community. And I think, you know, that's the lesson learned here. You know, you knew Jim, you knew this was a very important story, you knew it was part of queer history. And I think, you know, kudos to you for the wherewithal of getting it down and making sure that we didn't forget Jim.
And for people who want to be authors, who want to write, there's one article I read, a wonderful article. I forget the guy's name who wrote it, but he said, if you want to be an author, you need to write every day. He said that that it doesn't matter. Sit down. You only might work 5 minutes a day, but it's important to sit down. And I found out, I followed that advice, and I would sit down, and the 5 minutes once in a while ended up to be 5 hours because you get on a roll. And
It
he
sounds
said,
an awful lot like something Stephen King said in his book On Writing.
oh, did he? I have that book. And I love that book. It's very good.
And I would just like to round this off by saying, if you're not an author and you still want to know how you can help, walk in the door of any civil rights group, any support group, and just ask, how can I help? They'll have a list of things, and you can pick the one that you're best at. I assure you.
We are really good at that. Gays are really good at planning.
Absolutely.
All right, folks. Written on the Edges, produced by Rogue Ravens Media. For our disclaimers, links to social media, our listen stations, or to sign up as a guest, visit www.rotepodcast.com. If you enjoy learning about artists, please like and subscribe so you get the alerts for new episodes. Check out our Redbubble, support the store, and we'd like to extend a huge thank you.
Also check out our Patreon.
Oh, yes. Or if you want to directly support, Patreon/Road Podcast. We'd like to extend a huge thank you to Robert C. Steele for being with us. Robert, thank you so much for sharing your time and your story.
Thank you, guys. It's been a real pleasure.
Now, folks, pick up Band from California, the Jim Foshee story, and learn something about our past, because that's really important. Have a very happy holidays, and we'll talk to you all again soon. Bye-bye.
Closing time. The bums rush in melody, dear.